May 5, 1945, 4 a.m. Castle Itter, Austria. A medieval fortress perched on a hill overlooking the Austrian Alps. Inside the castle were 14 French VIP prisoners, former prime ministers, generals, a tennis champion, and resistance leaders, held captive by the SS since 1943. Guarding them were American soldiers from the 12th Armored Division, Wehrmacht soldiers who had defected from the German army, and a single Austrian resistance fighter. Outside, surrounding the castle, were 150 to 200 Waffen-SS troops preparing to attack. This was the Battle of Castle Itter, the only documented battle in World War II where American and German soldiers fought side by side against a common enemy. It occurred on May 5, 1945, one day before Germany's official surrender. By that date, Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the war in Europe was effectively over. But in the chaos of the final days, SS units refused to surrender. They hunted traitors, Germans who had abandoned the Nazi cause, and sought to execute high-value prisoners before the Allies could liberate them. The battle lasted 14 hours. The Americans and Germans were outnumbered 3-1. The castle's medieval walls, built to withstand sieges from centuries past, were tested by modern weapons, machine guns, Panzerfausts, and artillery. The defenders had minimal ammunition, no reinforcements, and no certainty that help would arrive. But they held. By the end of the battle, one defender was dead, Wehrmacht Major Josef Gangl, shot by an SS sniper while protecting a French prisoner. The rest survived. The prisoners were liberated, the SS was driven off, and history recorded one of the strangest and most improbable battles of the war. This analysis examines how the battle came to be, who the prisoners were, why Americans and Germans fought together, and what happened during the 14-hour siege. The 14 prisoners held at Castle Itter were not ordinary POWs. They were high-value French political and military figures arrested by the Nazis and held as hostages. Their value was political and symbolic. Some had governed France, others had resisted Nazi occupation. All were targets for execution if the Nazis decided they were no longer useful. The most prominent prisoners included Édouard Daladier, former Prime Minister of France, 1938 to 1940. Daladier had signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, attempting to appease Hitler. When appeasement failed and France fell in 1940, Daladier was arrested by the Vichy government and handed over to the Germans. He was imprisoned at Castle Itter in 1943. Paul Reynaud, former Prime Minister of France, 1940. Reynaud succeeded Daladier and led France during the German invasion. When France fell, Reynaud was arrested and imprisoned. His mistress, Christiane Mabir, was also imprisoned at the castle and shared his captivity. Édouard Herriot, former Prime Minister and President of the Chamber of Deputies. Herriot was a prominent politician arrested in 1942 for refusing to collaborate with the Nazis. General Maxime Weygand, former Commander-in-Chief of French forces in 1940. Weygand commanded French troops during the fall of France. After the defeat, he served in Vichy France, but was arrested by the Germans in 1942 when they suspected he might defect to the Allies. General Maurice Gamelin, former Supreme Commander of Allied forces at the start of the war. Gamelin commanded French forces in 1939 to 1940, but was replaced after the German invasion proved his strategies inadequate. He was arrested and held as a symbolic prisoner. Jean Borotra, French tennis champion and member of the Four Musketeers, legendary tennis players of the 1920s to 30s. Borotra had served in the Vichy government but was arrested in 1942 when the Germans suspected he was working with the resistance. He was athletic, energetic, and would play a critical role during the battle. François de la Roque, leader of the French Social Party and former military officer. La Roque had led a nationalist movement in the 1930s but opposed Nazi occupation. He was arrested in 1943. Marie-Agnès Caillou, sister of Charles de Gaulle. Her arrest was symbolic, Holding de Gaulle's sister was leverage against the Free French leader. She was imprisoned with her husband, Alfred Caillou. Other prisoners included Michel Clemenceau, son of former Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, Colonel André Brissac, and several others. Collectively, these prisoners represented the political and military leadership of France. If the Nazis chose to execute them, it would be a blow to French morale and a symbolic statement about the fate of those who resisted. The prisoners were held under guard by the SS, but by early 1945 the situation had changed. The guards knew Germany was losing. Some began to question their orders. By May 1945, the SS guards abandoned the castle, fleeing before the advancing Americans. The prisoners were left alone, unguarded, but also unprotected. If SS loyalists discovered the unguarded castle, the prisoners would be executed. The prisoners needed help. They needed soldiers willing to defend them. And in the chaos of the war's final days, they found an unlikely alliance. The German soldiers who fought at Castle Itter were not Nazis. They were Wehrmacht, regular army soldiers, who had defected or surrendered as the war ended. Their leader was Major Josef Sepp Gangl, an Austrian Wehrmacht officer who had turned against the SS. Gangl's story reflects the chaos and moral complexity of the war's final days. He was a career soldier who had served in the Wehrmacht since before the war. By 1945, he recognized that Germany had lost and that continuing to fight for the Nazis was pointless and immoral. He made contact with the Austrian resistance and began secretly aiding them. On May 3, 1945, Gangl was approached by Andreas Krobot, a former prisoner who had escaped from Castle Itter. Krobot informed the resistance that high-value French prisoners were trapped at the castle, unguarded and vulnerable to SS execution squads. Gangl decided to help. Gangl gathered a small group of Wehrmacht soldiers, approximately 10 men, who shared his views. These soldiers had deserted or were ready to defect. They were not motivated by loyalty to the Nazis, but by a desire to survive, to protect innocence, and perhaps to redeem themselves after years of fighting for a regime they no longer believed in. Gangl made contact with American forces. On May 4th, he met with Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr., commander of a unit from the U.S. 12th Armored Division. Lee was a 27-year-old officer leading a small group of American soldiers in a reconnaissance mission through Austria. Gangl explained the situation. French V-1Ps trapped at a castle, SS forces in the area, and a need for immediate help. Lee's decision was pragmatic and bold. He had fewer than 20 soldiers under his command. The castle was miles away, in mountainous terrain, with SS forces operating in the area. Reinforcements were uncertain, but the prisoners' value was undeniable. Rescuing former French prime ministers and generals would be a propaganda victory and a humanitarian necessity. Lee agreed to help. Gangl and Lee's forces traveled to Castle Itter on May 4th. When they arrived, the prisoners were relieved and cautiously optimistic, but the relief was short-lived. Intelligence reports and local informants confirmed that a large SS unit, estimated at 150 to 200 soldiers, was in the area and preparing to attack the castle. The SS had learned that the prisoners were there and that traitors, the defected Wehrmacht soldiers, were protecting them. The SS intended to execute the prisoners and kill the defectors. Lee assessed the situation. The castle was defensible. Thick medieval walls, high position on a hill, narrow approach roads, but the defenders were outnumbered and low on ammunition. Lee had one M4 Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, a handful of rifles, a few machine guns, and some grenades. The Wehrmacht soldiers had similar light weapons. The French prisoners, though mostly elderly politicians and officers, included some with military training. Lee armed them and assigned defensive positions. The stage was set for an improbable battle. Americans and Germans defending a medieval castle against the SS, with French V-1Ps armed and ready to fight for their own survival. The SS attack began at approximately 4 a.m. on May 5, 1945. The SS forces approached from multiple directions, using the cover of darkness and the forested terrain surrounding the castle. Their objective was to overwhelm the defenders quickly, execute the prisoners, and retreat before American reinforcements arrived. The defenders had positioned themselves strategically. Captain Lee commanded from inside the castle, coordinating the defense. Major Gangel positioned his Wehrmacht soldiers at key points along the walls and gates. The Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, was placed near the main gate to provide fire support. American soldiers manned machine guns and rifles. Some French prisoners, including General Weygand and Jean Borotra, took up rifles and were assigned to defensive positions. The initial SS assault focused on probing the defenses. SS soldiers fired small arms and machine guns at the castle walls, testing the defenders' response. The defenders returned fire, conserving ammunition but making each shot count. The thick medieval walls absorbed most of the incoming fire. The castle's elevated position gave defenders clear sightlines, making it difficult for the SS to advance without exposing themselves. As dawn broke, the SS intensified the attack. They brought up heavier weapons, Panzerfausts, anti-tank rockets, machine guns, and possibly a light artillery piece. The Panzerfausts were a serious threat to the Sherman tank. Lee ordered the tank repositioned multiple times to avoid being hit. The SS attempted to flank the castle by moving through the surrounding forest and approaching from the rear. However, the terrain was steep and difficult to navigate. Defenders spotted the flanking attempts and directed fire at the SS troops, forcing them to withdraw. The battle settled into a pattern. The SS would mass for an assault, the defenders would repel it with concentrated fire, and the SS would retreat, regroup, and try again. The defenders' ammunition dwindled with each assault. Lee rationed bullets, ordering soldiers to fire only when they had clear targets. By mid-morning, the situation was critical. The Sherman tank had been hit by a Panzerfaust and was disabled. The tank's gun still worked, but the tank could not move. It became a stationary pillbox, providing fire support but vulnerable to further attack. Ammunition reserves were nearly exhausted. If the SS launched one more major assault, the defenders might not have enough bullets to stop it. As the battle raged, Captain Lee realized that the defenders could not hold indefinitely. They needed reinforcements. The nearest American units were miles away in the town of Kufstein. Someone had to get through SS lines, reach the Americans, and bring help. Jean Borotra, the French tennis champion, volunteered. Borotra was 46 years old, but he was still athletic and fast. More importantly, he was fearless. He had spent years in Nazi captivity, and he was determined not to die in the final days of the war without fighting back. Lee approved the plan. Borotra would leave the castle, navigate through the forest, evade or outrun SS patrols, and reach American lines in Kufstein. It was a desperate plan with a low probability of success, but it was the only option. At approximately 10 a.m., Borotra prepared to leave. He wore civilian clothing to avoid being shot as a combatant if captured. He was given a brief overview of the route and wished luck. Then he climbed over the castle wall and disappeared into the forest. Borotra moved quickly and quietly through the woods. He used his knowledge of the terrain, gained from being held in the area for months, to avoid main roads and likely SS positions. He heard gunfire from the castle behind him, a reminder that his friends and fellow prisoners were still fighting. At one point, Borotra encountered an SS patrol. He hid in the underbrush, remaining motionless as the soldiers passed within yards of his position. Once they were gone, he continued. He ran when he could, walked when he had to, and navigated by the sun and his memory of the landscape. After several hours, Borotra reached the outskirts of Kufstein. He encountered American sentries and identified himself. The sentries were skeptical. A French civilian appearing out of the forest claiming that Americans and Germans were fighting together at a castle sounded absurd. But Borotra was insistent. He demanded to speak to a commanding officer. Borotra was taken to an American command post. He explained the situation. French W1Ps under siege, Americans and Wehrmacht defending, SS attacking, ammunition running low. The American officers verified Baratra's identity and the plausibility of his story through radio communication with other units. They authorized a relief force. A column of American tanks and infantry was dispatched to Castle Itter. But the journey would take time. Baratra had succeeded in his mission, but whether help would arrive in time was uncertain. While Baratra was en route to Kufstein, the battle at the castle intensified. The SS launched another assault, concentrating fire on the main gate. The disabled Sherman tank returned fire, and defenders poured rifle and machine gun fire into the advancing SS troops. The assault was repelled, but the defenders' ammunition was nearly gone. During a lull in the fighting, Major Gangle moved to a window overlooking the courtyard to assess the situation. He was coordinating with Captain Lee and checking on the French prisoners. One of the prisoners, former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, was near the window, exposed to fire from outside. An SS sniper positioned in the forest had been watching the window. The sniper saw movement and fired. The bullet struck Major Gangle in the head, killing him instantly. He collapsed in front of Reynaud. The shot had been intended for Reynaud. The sniper likely did not know Gangle's identity and simply fired at the figure in the window. Gangle's death was accidental from the sniper's perspective, but it was nonetheless a deliberate targeting of a defender. Gangle's death devastated the defenders. The Wehrmacht soldiers lost their leader. The Americans lost an ally and a valuable tactical mind. The French prisoners lost a protector who had risked his life to save them. Captain Lee assumed full command. He ordered the defenders to remain in position and continue fighting. There was no time to mourn. The SS would attack again, and the defenders had to hold. Gangle's body was moved to a secure location inside the castle. The defenders vowed to hold until reinforcements arrived, not just for the prisoners, but to honor Gangle's sacrifice. He had defected from the Wehrmacht, allied with the Americans, and died defending people he had no obligation to protect. His death symbolized the moral choices individuals made in the war's final days, choices between loyalty to a collapsing regime and doing what was right. By early afternoon, the defenders were nearly out of ammunition. The SS had launched multiple assaults, each repelled, but the cost in bullets was unsustainable. The defenders were down to their last magazines. If the SS attacked again, the defenders would have to fight hand-to-hand or surrender. At approximately 4 p.m., the sound of engines was heard in the distance. The defenders tensed. Was it more SS reinforcements, or was it the Americans? Within minutes, the answer became clear. A column of American tanks and armored vehicles appeared on the road leading to the castle. The relief force had arrived. The SS forces, seeing the approaching American armor, began to withdraw. They had no heavy weapons capable of stopping tanks, and they knew reinforcements meant the battle was lost. The SS retreated into the forest, abandoning the siege. Some were captured by the advancing Americans. Others escaped into the mountains, eventually surrendering or being hunted down in the following days. The relief force entered the castle. The French prisoners, exhausted but alive, greeted the Americans with relief and gratitude. Captain Lee briefed the relief commander on the situation, including Gangle's death and the role of the Wehrmacht soldiers in the defense. The Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought alongside the Americans were initially uncertain about their fate. Would they be treated as POWs, as traitors by the SS remnants? Captain Lee vouched for them, explaining their role in the defense. The Wehrmacht soldiers were disarmed but treated with respect. They were not imprisoned as POWs but were released after brief questioning. Major Gangle was honored as a hero, and his sacrifice was recognized by both the Americans and the French prisoners. The French prisoners were evacuated from the castle and transported to safety. They were later repatriated to France, where they resumed their lives and political careers. Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud both testified at post-war trials and wrote memoirs about their captivity. Jean Baratra, the tennis champion who had run through SS lines to summon help, returned to competitive tennis and later worked for international sports organizations. The battle was over. The siege had lasted 14 hours. One defender, Major Joseph Gangel, had been killed. The rest survived. The prisoners were free. And history recorded the only battle where Americans and Germans fought together against the SS. The Battle of Kassel Itter occurred on May 5, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945, effective May 8 in Europe. The battle was fought literally in the final days of the war, when the outcome was no longer in doubt. But the battle mattered because it demonstrated that even in the chaos of collapse, individuals could choose to do the right thing. Major Joseph Gangel was buried with military honors. The French prisoners attended his funeral and paid tribute to his sacrifice. Gangel's story is commemorated in Austria, where he is remembered as a symbol of resistance against the Nazis in the war's final days. A street in the town of WorldWarII, near Kassel Itter, is named after him. Captain John C. Lee was recognized for his leadership during the battle. He received commendations and continued his military career after the war. He rarely spoke publicly about the battle, believing it was simply his duty. Lee died in 1973. The French prisoners spoke about the battle in their memoirs and interviews. Paul Reynaud wrote about the experience, praising the Americans and Germans who defended them. Edouard Daladier mentioned it in his writings. Jean Barotra recounted his escape through SS lines in interviews, describing it as the most terrifying experience of his life. The Wehrmacht soldiers who fought at Kassel Itter faded into history. Their names were not widely recorded, and most returned to civilian life without recognition. This reflects the moral ambiguity of their position. They were German soldiers who had served the Wehrmacht, even if they defected at the war's end. Post-war Germany and Austria were not eager to celebrate Wehrmacht veterans, even those who had fought against the SS. The battle itself was not widely known for decades. It was overshadowed by the larger events of the war's end: Germany's surrender, the liberation of concentration camps, the beginnings of the Cold War. But in recent years, historians have revisited the battle, recognizing its uniqueness. In 2013, historian Stephen Harding published The Last Battle, a detailed account of the Battle of Kassel Itter. The book brought the story to a wider audience. Harding's research included interviews with survivors, examination of military records, and visits to the castle. The book highlighted the improbability of the battle, the alliance of former enemies, the medieval setting, the high-value prisoners, and the timing. Kassel Itter still stands today. It is a private residence and not open to the public, but it remains a landmark. A memorial plaque commemorates the battle and honors Major Gangel. Visitors to the area can see the castle from a distance and reflect on the strange and improbable events that occurred there. The Battle of Kassel Itter is unique in World War II history because it challenges simplistic narratives about the war. The war is often framed as a clear conflict between good, the Allies, and evil, the Nazis. But the final days of the war revealed complexities that do not fit neatly into this framework. The Wehrmacht soldiers who fought at Kassel Itter were not heroes for most of the war. They had served in an army that invaded and occupied countries, committed war crimes, and supported a genocidal regime. But in the war's final days, they made a choice. They could have fled, surrendered, or continued fighting for the Nazis. Instead, they chose to defect, ally with the Americans, and defend innocent people. That choice does not erase their past, but it demonstrates that individuals, even those who served evil regimes, can choose redemption. Captain Lee and the American soldiers exemplified pragmatism and moral clarity. Lee could have refused to work with Wehrmacht defectors. He could have seen them as enemies, regardless of their current actions. Instead, he recognized the situation for what it was: a tactical necessity and a moral imperative. The prisoners needed defenders, and the Wehrmacht soldiers were willing to provide that defense. Lee judged them by their actions in the moment, not by their past. The French prisoners showed courage and adaptability. These were elderly politicians and officers, men accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. But when the battle began, they picked up rifles and fought. They trusted the Americans and Germans who defended them, Even though some had been political enemies before the war, they survived because they were willing to work with anyone who would help them. The SS forces at Castle Itter represented the fanaticism that persisted even as the Nazi regime collapsed. These soldiers continued fighting when the war was already lost, motivated by ideology, hatred, or fear of punishment. Their willingness to execute prisoners and kill defectors in the war's final days shows that for some, surrender was unthinkable. The battle demonstrates the danger of fanaticism untethered from reality. The Battle of Castle Itter is a reminder that war is not monolithic. It is a collection of individual decisions, moral choices, and human interactions. The battle shows that enemies can become allies, that redemption is possible, and that even in the final moments of a war, courage and humanity can prevail. The battle also highlights the randomness and contingency of history. If Gangel had not defected, if Krobot had not escaped and informed the resistance, if Barotra had not successfully reached American lines, if Lee had not agreed to help, the outcome could have been different. The prisoners might have been executed. The battle might never have occurred. History is shaped not just by large forces and great leaders, but by individuals making choices in moments of crisis. The Battle of Castle Itter was small in scale, a few dozen soldiers, a single castle, 14 hours. But it encapsulates the moral complexity, the human drama, and the improbable alliances that defined the war's end. It is a story worth remembering, not because it changed the outcome of the war, but because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, people can choose to do the right thing.